So just to move on to what we're going to be doing today. So two sessions for today with a nice break in between around about 3 o'clock-ish. And we're going to just be thinking firstly about inequality from two perspectives, really. The whole programme really comes out of our findings so far in the impact of COVID-19 research, where we have all in our different strands been noticing some important themes emerging around inequality. So firstly, we're going to be looking at inequality in the workforce in the first section, and in the second, from the perspective of audiences and engagement. And as I say, what we're going to do is run straight through, hear from our researchers, and then have a little bit of time for debate. And we'd really love to hear from you. Please do use the chat. And if you think there's anything you'd like to speak to, try and indicate, and I'll try and make sure that we've got some room for you, but bear with me. Right, just to say as well that because we're very keen centre of cultural value and people talking to each other and enabling exchange and discussion, we are going to share contact details with everybody here. So if for any reason you, if you said yes on the form, that's what we're going to be doing afterwards, and if you said no, we won't. So without more ado, let's just move on to think about some of the context. So what are we doing here today? As I say, we're really keen to present some of the emerging findings from our impact of COVID-19 AHRC funded research, but we're also hoping that that's going to generate some discussion with all of you. It's an amazing, interesting roster of people joining us today. I think we're looking to you a bit to help us with our research as well, because we hope that you're going to be shaping some of the questions that we need to be asking as the research continues. And I suppose we're asking ourselves how we make sure that our research and findings are accelerating positive change through these very interesting times. So we want to explore your experience of research. How's it landing with you? What questions are you asking yourselves? Are we missing something? So that's part of what we're hoping to get out of today. We also have set ourselves a challenge to try and be fairly positive in the way we think about the findings. To some extent, you know, there is clearly a very interesting gap opening up in society between the haves and have-nots as a result of the pandemic. And although some of the research may lead us to feel like hand-wringing and anxiety and worry, we also feel that obviously this is a moment in which we can seize the day, if you like, and I suppose it is a moment of change. Can we take what we're learning and use that as an impetus for change? And that's very much the way in which we'd like to frame the conversation. So we're hoping to hear from those of you who are responding to some of these trends with positive ways of doing things, positive responses to what's happening. So we're very much looking for you to proffer examples of great practice and interesting experimentation that you're experiencing at the moment as well. So pop those in the chats, we'll come on to that in a moment. So moving on then, can I introduce to you, I'm just going to tell you quickly who's joining us today, because we have a great group of people. Firstly, Professor Ben Walmsley, who is overall pulling together the COVID-19 impact research. He's the director of the Centre of Cultural Value based at the University of Leeds. We're also delighted to welcome two guests, Dr. Roaa Ali, who's Research Associate in Cultural Production and Consumption at the University of Manchester, and Lara Ratnaraja, who is a cultural consultant who I'm sure many of you know, specialising in diversity, innovation and leadership, collaboration and cultural policy. And the two of them very kindly have come to give us a response to some of the findings, just to shape some of the thinking and debate. But also speaking our fellow researchers, Dr. Mark Taylor from the Quantitative Social Sciences and HRC Leadership Fellow at the University of Sheffield, Dr. Ben Dunn, Postdoctoral Research Associate for the Centre for Cultural Value, Oliver, my colleague at the Audience Agency, our Policy Research Director, and Doctors John Wright and Karen Gray, who are both Postdoctoral Research Associates for the Centre for Cultural Value. So a nice roster of folk for you today. I'm now going to hand over to Ben, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the research project itself. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited to share these emerging findings from our COVID-19 research project. I guess the caveat, therefore, is that these findings are very much emergent. We've been going for about 5 months, since the 1st of September. And as you all know, the situation is evolving really rapidly, too rapidly almost for any researcher to keep up with. So it's, you know, we really wanted to not wait till the end in usual academic tradition of the research till we shared it with you. we want to share iteratively as we're going along, and we're really looking forward to hearing how our research is landing with people today. And I know that we're engaging with quite a lot of you across the research as it unfolds as well. So welcome, thank you for joining us. I'm not going to take up too much time because I know you're all here to hear about the research and our findings, but I thought it might be useful just to give people a kind of overview of the project and the framing, to explain a little bit about what's in scope, what's out of scope. This is a national research project, and by national I do mean UK-wide. We're looking and working with organisations across the 4 nations of the UK. And the aim, therefore, is really to try our best to provide some kind of clear national picture of the impacts of the pandemic on the cultural sector. And, you know, looking at the attendees today, it's great to see a really rich mix of people from different audience groups. So we very much hope that our findings and the implications that we're picking out this afternoon will be useful for all of you, those of you from a policy or funder background, and those of you working in the cultural sector itself, and of course for fellow academics. So who's doing the research? We're a national consortium from universities across the UK. There are 16 of us in the research team. And I'd just like to acknowledge our 2 key partners in this research. We can't do this kind of scope of research on our own. So we're working with the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre based at Nesta, who are leading on the policy engagement work. The idea really being to ensure that findings are communicated in as timely and effective way as possible to all types of policymaker, local, regional and national. And the audience agency, you've already met Anne, but you're going to hear a lot more later from Oliver Mantell about the findings of the audience agency's population survey, the Cultural Monitor. And in terms of methodology, I guess inevitably this is I would say a radically mixed methodology. So we have a combination of quantitative analysis, so people who are absolutely trying to unpick the figures and the data, looking at ONS data, labour force survey data in particular, so looking at the impact of COVID on the cultural workforce, some meta-analyses of existing surveys. The other thing you're going to hear about this afternoon is emerging findings from interviews with our case study cohort. So we're looking at theatres in England, festivals in Scotland, galleries and museums in Northern England, emerging cultural leaders in Northern Ireland, and screen industries and kind of gaming in Wales. And as you know, I've already explained that this research is evolving and iterative, so we're trying to adapt the methodology as our findings emerge. So we're now drilling down a little bit into trying to understand the impact on freelancers within those cohorts in particular, and looking at emerging cultural practitioners. So this idea perhaps that people have been talking about of a lost generation. So lots of case study interviews. We're also co-creating a new platform called Yarn, which will collate individual stories. So what audience members, community groups have been doing during the lockdown in terms of cultural engagement. So the aim there being to really collate some really rich individual stories of cultural value and engagement. There's some social media analysis conducted by colleagues at Cardiff, looking at some of the kind of mega events like Culture in Quarantine, for example. And finally, a large ecosystem analysis of Greater Manchester, so looking at the impact of the pandemic on a large city region, which is led by my colleague Abigail Gilmore at Manchester, and Ben Dunn will be presenting some of that research anon. And finally, the timeline. So it's a 15-month project, started on the 1st of September, and we're running through till the end of November. So plenty of opportunity to engage with the project. We'll be, as I said, have been or will be in touch with lots of you here today. There'll be other opportunities for you to listen to our research as we try and disseminate it. So there'll be another webinar coming up in June, July time, and a final conference in November. So we very much look forward to keeping the conversation going and to seeing you all as the research progresses. Thank you very much again for coming this afternoon, and I'm going to hand back to Anne to introduce the next speaker.
Brilliant, yeah, thank you, Ben. So you can hear this is a very multifaceted research programme, and absolutely fascinating for us because we're often just working on audience and engagement research or population, thinking about consumers and participants. And it's been really fascinating, of course, being able to talk with all the researchers who are working on the different things. Hence, the way we've structured these events, where we're talking at grand themes. So to dive in now, the grand theme of the day being the great unequaliser, and I'm going to hand over to Mark from University of Sheffield to talk about inequalities in the workforce. Thanks, Mark. You ready? You there?
Yep.
Great.
And it's me. Thanks very much, Anne. And good afternoon to everybody. As Anne has said, and as Ben was talking about, I'm going to be talking for a couple of minutes about some large survey data that is part of the labour force survey, which is collected by the Office for National Statistics, in order to sort of summarise what's been happening at a big macro level across the different cultural and creative industries. And so this first slide here that you can see summarises the overall size of the workforce in creative occupations in all 4 of the quarters of 2020. And there's quite a lot going on here, so I'll sort of briefly summarise. The first thing to flag, and I think, in an audience like this, people are very familiar with this fact, but the cultural and creative industries is a very broad category. It has lots of different kinds of occupations in it. And a lot of what's happened to those different parts of the sector looks quite different. And so just to sort of reiterate, what I'm talking about here is specifically creative occupations. So as a kind of crude example, somebody who works as a graphic designer in a bank would be included here, but somebody who works as an accountant in a theatre wouldn't be included here. And in most of these, you can see that, and just what we have is for each of the quarters of 2020, we have the estimate from the labour force survey of the number of people who were employed in that sector in each of those quarters. And then the grey bar around it gives you a kind of measure of uncertainty. Because, for example, in the first quarter of 2020, we think that about 39,000 people were employed working in occupations in museums, galleries and libraries. It might have been more like 45,000. It might have been more like 30,000. We're not totally sure. Because of the way that survey methods work, we think it's going to be roughly within that range. And so what you can see here is that for most of the parts of the cultural and creative industries, the formal size of the sector in terms of the number of people working in it didn't actually change that much. You can see examples like advertising and marketing is relatively flat, design is relatively flat, architecture, if anything, seemed to increase slightly over the period, although we're not sure about that because of what I was just talking about in terms of survey methods. There is one significant exception to this, which you can see in the bottom left, which is music, performing and visual arts. So this is a cluster of occupations that includes things like actors, it includes musicians, it includes visual artists, so, including jobs like painters. And you can see that what happened there is between Q1 and Q2, so that's the first 3 months of last year. It's sort of dim memory now that the first 3 months we were largely able to do whatever we wanted. Into Q2, which was the first 3 months of significant lockdown, there was a big drop there. But subsequently, there doesn't seem to have been a recovery into Q3 or 4. If anything, those numbers seem to have got worse. But if we can have a look at the next slide, there is a little bit more to the story than that. Because this shows you, of the people that were left, how many hours were they working? And you can see the green line in each case shows you the percentage of people working in these sectors who, while they were formally employed in the sector, weren't actually working any hours. So people who were asked, okay, last week, how many hours did you work? And you might think that in some cases, this might reflect the furlough scheme doing what it's supposed to. You know, people who work in a particular sector, but they can't actually work because, you know, say you work in a physical venue, if performances weren't able to take place, then if people remain in the sector, you might think that furlough is working in the right way. And there's some evidence of that in sectors like film, TV, radio, and photography, where the number of people who were working full time dipped quite a lot into the second quarter of 2020, but then started to increase. But the real exception to this, again, is music, performing, and visual arts, where the fraction of people working no hours increased hugely as the pandemic hit, and then it only continued to increase. And this is among the relatively smaller fraction of people, the relatively smaller number of people working in the sector at all. I've just got one more slide to show you, which is to try to understand how this has been unequally felt. When we look at the people who left the sector during 2020, so those people who might have been working in a creative occupation in one quarter, but then weren't in the second quarter, we can see, well, there's a bit of a mix and it's difficult to say with too much certainty. One thing that is quite striking is that the under 25s were particularly badly affected. Younger people were much more likely to leave their creative occupation than people aged over 25. We also see differences, as you can see, where people of colour were more likely to leave, as were people who didn't have degrees, and also disabled people. But in those cases, as I was saying before, it's a little bit more difficult to be certain about this because of the survey methods. Loads more to talk about on this, but I think it's best to pass over at this point, and then we'll revisit some of these conversations, I think, in the discussion in a minute's time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, I'm going to, I know there was a huge amount of information there, barely scratching the surface. But so feel free to put your questions in the chat. We're going to be picking them up as we go along, but I am going to move straight on to introduce Ben Dunn, who's also going to be thinking about the similar sorts of inequalities from a different perspective. Keep the questions coming. We'll pick them all up in the section afterwards. Okay, Ben.
Lovely. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. I think you can see me. Thanks very much, Anne. So our presentation is the hour because I'm working with Abby Gilmore, Ben mentioned here earlier. So our presentation today focuses on two areas of emerging findings from our research, looking at inequalities in the distribution of cultural recovery funding within Greater Manchester ecosystem and the shifting relationships between organisations and freelancers in that context. So to give you a sense of context, the Greater Manchester City region consists of 10 district authorities and the combined authority, the GMCA, with Manchester City at its geographical and political centre, as you can see from the map there. So we've been working in Greater Manchester since November last year, and the research has broadly taken place in two stages: a desk-based stage looking at policy context and response across the districts, which was followed by our first round of interviews with around 35 cultural leaders and policymakers who are linked to a number of networks that have steered cultural response in the region. Next slide, please. So since the start of the pandemic, the GMCA and Manchester City Council have worked closely with cultural organisations to support bids to CRF and other government funds. And this has resulted in over 24 million of CRF funding distributed across 100 organisations, and the single largest capital kickstart grant nationally awarded to Manchester City Council on behalf of the factory. In response to the pandemic, the GMCA has also guaranteed funding until the end of the financial year for its own portfolio of 35 cultural organisations, with funding drawn from the district authorities. Next slide, please. So, however, the distribution of funding within the city region tells its own story of geographic inequalities. 33 of the region's 42 Arts Council funded NPOs are in Manchester, as are 20 of the 35 GM portfolio. As a whole, the city region has been very successful in securing government funding or government support, but the vast majority is concentrated within Manchester city centre itself. 62 out of the 100 CRF recipients are located in Manchester, including the only 3 awards over £1 million and 4 of the 6 successful Capital Kickstart recipients. Indeed, the Factory's Kickstart Award alone represents an entire fifth of the total Kickstart funding nationally, 3.5 times as much as the next highest award, and 3 times the total awarded to all London-based organisations. Described by interviewees as trickle-down culture, the uneven distribution of investment across the region raises questions about parity and equality. It seems that Building Back is a largely building-based project which represents a challenge to levelling up within a region-wide cultural ecosystem. It also raises questions about how resources and support can be distributed to those outside of funded organisations. So to unpick this further, we're going to look at two examples from our fieldwork that illustrate different models designed to benefit freelance cultural workers in response to the pandemic: the Factory Academy and GM Artist Hub. Thank you. So the Factory Academy is a vocational training programme for freelancers. Led by the Factory as part of its remit for the city region, this building-based scheme seeks to create a network of employment opportunities across a consortium of 25 partner organisations. It is committed to a target of 10,000 development opportunities for young people in Greater Manchester over 5 years, with a focus on improving diversity. In contrast, the GM Artist Hub is a web-based partnership between 13 organisations, with some overlap with Academy partners. Developed in consultation with freelancers and advocates, the Hub has provided targeted advisory sessions, grant writing support, micro-commissions and seed funding in response to the pandemic, reaching around 1,000 freelancers. Operationally distinct from the organisations that support it, the Hub sees its future as a support and advocacy body, working with cultural organisations to encourage collaborations that prioritise the personal and economic well-being of the freelance workforce. So both models take an ecosystems approach to sector recovery, looking beyond the viability of individual organisations. Both also leverage Manchester City Centre's concentration of cultural and economic capital to provide a response designed to benefit the region as a whole. Where they differ is in the methods by which they distribute this capital and the relationship between these and pre-existing inequalities of access and opportunity across the region. For example, next slide, please. The Academy aims to address underrepresentation by leveraging economic power to support paid or subsidised opportunities for conventionally excluded sections of the population. Despite this progressive intention, however, this approach reproduces trickle-down model of distribution that relies on the centralisation of funding and influence within Manchester, mobilising a large freelance workforce without an underlying commitment to professional or economic security. Conversely, the Artist Hub's partnership model separates freelancers from the institutional pressures felt by partner organisations and introduces a ground-up ethos of collective responsibility for progressive change to the process of building back. However, this decentralised approach to cultural leadership also lacks the security of direct financial support or political backing from the local authority or national bodies. So ultimately, neither model presents a solution to all of the challenges brought about by the pandemic. In comparison, however, they highlight important questions about how the process of cultural recovery might take fuller responsibility for a vulnerable freelance workforce, and the opportunity for the process of building back to underwrite the structural change needed to protect and improve diversity in this sector. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Ben. I mean, you've fulfilled the brief brilliantly there by talking about what are organisations doing to directly confront some of these issues. So it's a really interesting story there. Now, Lara, I'm going to turn to you. So somebody who has, well, I think it's fair to say, dedicated their entire career to helping to develop a more inclusive cultural sector. Can I ask you how that's making you feel?
Well, I'm not hugely surprised. I mean, if anyone is surprised at this, then you really probably need to wake up slightly. I mean, none of it shows anything that is wholly unexpected whatsoever. And especially as kind of Mark pointed out with his slides, where a live experience, where you needed an audience, where that was a de facto standard, say music, performing arts, visual arts, these are the sectors that have shrunk dramatically in comparison with, say, the more service-driven side of the creative industry sector, where more people could remote work, and organisations where staff could be furloughed, and that tended to be more in the larger institutional public sector funded bodies such as museums and galleries. So you can see why there's a kind of static almost, especially the first 2 quarters of museums and galleries, for example, where staff were furloughed, and then we didn't have the scale of redundancies that have subsequently happened. What's interesting when you look at performing arts, visual arts and music, and basically people in the chat have already done my response, so you can just read the chat. But basically we're talking, this is a much higher number of freelancers. There's a huge number of music venues that have been closed or are mothballed. The impact on the nighttime economy on things like music as well. So there's a symbiotic relationship that these aspects of the cultural venues that we're talking about don't exist in isolation. And there have been far greater numbers of redundancies in terms of front of house staff. But equally, coming back to freelancers, I think in the Arts Professional article that was done, that the research said that 88% of workers in these sectors were in some form of self-employment. I wasn't hugely surprised at the data, and I don't think anyone can be surprised at the lack of financial stability, networks, and inherent bias in the cultural structure means that the percentage leaving the sector were those that are the most underrepresented and disadvantaged by the sector: women, ethnically diverse people, non-graduates, disabled, and young people, because these are the people with the least amount of connections and the least amount of financial kind of comfort, shall we say, in terms of being able to ride this out. We're talking about people that are on 0-hour or sessional contracts, people that are much more flexible, and they're the most vulnerable and they're the most at risk. So the data doesn't show anything. I think that is going to surprise anyone. I think also, if we actually looked at occupational data, I'm not quite sure if that's something that's going to happen. I would probably be willing to bet quite a lot that they will predominantly be front of house staff. They'll be entry level or early career roles, because particularly when you look around ethnic diversity, that's where people are employed at, and that's where people tend to stay. So there's a bigger kind of issue really about the structures that have allowed this to happen. I'll briefly talk about the equality data that you can get from the Arts Council. I'm sure David O'Brien's rolling his eyes at this now. The latest data actually goes back to 1819, but 11% of the cultural MPO workforce is ethnically diverse. 10% of CEOs are ethnically diverse, 6% of disabled, 6% of the workforce is disabled, and 11% is LGBTQ+. So it goes on. It's, this is not anything that we didn't know. And of course, now what this does present is an opportunity to completely reset and disrupt the structural equities within the sector, not least because audiences have lived without a physical cultural infrastructure for nearly a year now, and they have carried on enjoying a really highly eclectic cultural life online across many different demographics. So now isn't the time to really start thinking, oh, we can go back to normal, because actually, what does normal mean? If people have been engaging with culture online through all the demographics that people want to have in their venues, and they're not in your venues, then you maybe need to reframe and rethink about what you're doing. The Greater Manchester modelling was really interesting, and the examples actually that were given, that Ben gave about the factory and the GM Artists Hub, show two distinct yet very complementary led initiatives, one of which is institutional and one is grassroots. And I think I agree with Ben, it's too simplistic to talk about one model versus another, but about how a wider ecosystem can exist, not just in a city centre, but across the city region, and how that should benefit everyone within that cultural ecology. And in terms of inequity, we just can't keep relying on the existing cultural structures, which continue to perpetuate these inequities. They're flawed, and they're instrumentalist when it comes to diversity and equality. What we need is a collaborative and symbiotic ecosystem, which is more fluid and responsive, but also it's got to be more iterative, because we're going to flex and move through recovery. It's not like we've all been vaccinated and it all goes back to normal. That's not what's going to happen here. We're going to move through recovery in different stages and different periods, and that's going to be over a number of years. So we've got to look at things that are not just venue-based activity, but non-venue-based activity. Because the one thing about lockdown that has changed is that the notions of what national and regional are, that's completely been disrupted. You can access digital content anywhere, globally, nationally, but equally our high streets have got really important to us. That's the kind of, probably the first 4 months I've been into Birmingham city centre where I live 3 times in 4 months, I think. So our local and our global are now completely important. So what cultural systems can't do is ignore that wider impact on city centres and town high streets, and our culture, as well as being on your doorstep, is also global. So where this is an opportunity, and I think I'm kind of trying to be positive, Anne, is that we should be, and we can start reframing what cultural value looks like. And we can stop using this really centralized production model that invites people in and gives people permission to view culture through this really centralized lens of homogeneity. There is no longer a sole authorial cultural voice that mandates what cultural value is, or indeed where it's based.
Thank you indeed. You did indeed, despite the concerns, which are real, right? So thank you very much for framing that a little bit more. But I really like your idea of a what we need now is a network model, a collaborative and responsive ecosystem. it's a different thing. And I think that's really interesting because it sort of chimes with what you've been talking about here in the chat. I notice both Sivan and Scan, the visual art networks in Scotland and England, both, you know, very concerned there about freelancers. I'm going to yes, thank you. We've got some cultural democracy questions coming up here, which are going to be interesting in a moment. I'm going to just, obviously this issue of freelancers is of interest to everybody. Mark, can I just ask you, while you're thinking of your questions, which you've got a few minutes to put in there, guys. Mark, can I just ask you, freelancers clearly are an area of concern. It's coming out in your work. It came out in what Lara and Ben were just talking about just there. What else do we know?
So we, those of us who are working on the survey work as part of the project have been looking into freelancers in a bit of detail, and we'll have more to say in probably next week, maybe the week after. But just to sort of briefly summarise, a big part of the declines that we see in the music, performing, visual arts sector is the fact that freelancers have been disproportionately affected. There's a lot of freelancers in these sectors. And for example, we know that freelancers, it's been more difficult, you know, if you're a freelancer, it's not straightforward to get furloughed. It's not been straightforward to engage with government support schemes in the same way as it has been elsewhere. And so we've seen that there's been like a large part of the job losses that we've seen in the sector have been freelancers being disproportionately affected. In addition to this, when we look at where freelancers are sort of disappearing, one of the things that's quite striking is that actually the number of freelancers of colour working in the sector hasn't decreased as much as maybe we would have expected. But actually this can be explained by the fact that there's so few freelancers of colour in the first place relative to white freelancers. In addition to this, we found as with overall numbers, that this is quite heavily driven by age. The number of freelancers in their 20s has really sort of collapsed, whereas for older groups, those differences aren't maybe as profound. But like I say, this is all work in progress, and we'll have more to say in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that's really interesting. Kat Cook says here, do we know how lots of people saying things. Kat says, do we know how the depletion of freelancers and skills will affect larger, more stable organisations in terms of quality, innovation, and the wider economic? I mean, you know, there's clearly that is an area of consideration. Anybody, Lara, have you any thoughts on that one?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, I was in the...
So Kat's question here in the chat is, do we know how the depletion of freelancers and skills is going to affect the larger, more stable organisations in terms of quality, innovation and the wider economic? I mean, that speaks very directly to your question about thinking in a more network way, really, doesn't it?
But I think there's two responses to that. One, I think some venues and some institutions have really tried to support freelancers. And I think if one thing this has shown actually the value of freelancers, and I'm freelance, you know, the value of freelancers within the sector. But I think the trouble is we need to reframe what we are asking freelancers to do. So if venues go back and say, well, this is how we're going to present work in the same kind of old-fashioned way, then they will just employ in the same way. So if we're saying everyone that was front of house is predominantly, for example, young or ethnically diverse, for example, then where's the plurality of voices throughout an institution or a cultural organisation at different levels? So we always just default to the same kind of mechanism. So I think obviously it will impact on organisations, but they might not see that necessarily if they're not really changing how they are producing and I'll use distribution just in the wider context, but distributing work in the way they always have done, because it's a model that's flawed.
Yeah. So call there for new distribution models, rethinking, and I think that echoes some of the things that people have put in the chat here. Michaela from Attenborough talking here about work that's happening in Leicester. I think that, and several suggestions here around just sort of working in completely different ways. Has anybody else got a question for our panel before we have a quick break?
Can I just I'll pick up one thing. The Leicester thing's really interesting because I know Michaela, I know Paulette Brooks really well from Serendipity. So I know there is a group about how the MPOs are working together to address some of the issues around you know, equality and diversity. So I think there's some interesting case studies out there that we should be kind of exploring.
Well, exactly. I think in the pursuit of what do we do, I think that's absolutely spot on, and I think there is room within the research project for us to look at well, as Ben's just been demonstrating, to look at actually the who is responding and who's doing that in interesting and in ways that, as you said, are about resetting and disrupting rather than just replicating and hanging on. I think that's absolutely spot on. So what I'm going to suggest is that we're now at the point for a break. There's been a lot of ideas and thoughts and facts flying around, so feel free while you're reflecting in a quick break to add some comments on this. A nice long one here from Trevor, which I'm going to absorb over the break time. Mikey, have you got us a poll that we're going to do during the break? I believe we have, just because if the idea that you're going to do nothing for 7 minutes, obviously that's not good enough. So we've got a quick poll for you indeed. To what extent do you think you or your organisation will make progress on inequality following the pandemic? So we'd love to know what you think of those things, and we'll reflect on that. So can I suggest now that we now have you've got a 5-minute break, folks. So calling you back here at 12 minutes past 3, and we'll be kicking off with another kind of discussion about inequality in audiences engagement. See you shortly. You had time to make a cup of coffee unless you were on immediate standby at that point. Meanwhile, some people have taken the opportunity, the hardworking among us, to write some interesting comments over the break time. I think we might have the result of the poll in a second. Meanwhile, very germane to the poll, I think, a comment from Charles Ingram here: what will it take for the radical change we're looking for to be achieved? It has to happen, otherwise the same conversations will be happening over and over again until we are blue in the face. Some people, I think, bluer than others. Absolutely right. So when does research reflect action? I think that's a very good question. I mean, to some extent, ideally, I think we're thinking, how could actually our research prompt action? So I suppose what we're looking for are being able to document and look in some detail at where people are doing things that are genuinely disruptive and interesting, and trying to find ways of amplifying that. It's a really interesting question. Lots of interest in Creative Commons work that Trevor's just spoken about here, doing work with metropolitan mayors on their work around, as more funds flow into that local authority framework, actually how can we make sure that they are distributed in different and interesting ways. Some really good comments there too. However, I'm going to ask you, keep on talking. There's a question in here about parents and how they've been affected. I don't know if anyone has the for example, Mark, if you've got some answers to that, you might want to just drop that into the chat, because we're now going to move on to part 2 of the debate. Keep the comments coming. We're all looking at them and documenting them, and we'll find a way of responding, if not here, then soon. So section 2, inequalities in audiences engagement. Can I, without further ado, hand over to my colleague, Oliver Mantell from the Audience Agency, to tell you what's been coming out of our Cultural Participation Monitor. Ollie, you there?
I am, yes, thanks, Anne. So I'm going to be talking about inequality and the public and audiences and the impact on those and how that might affect cultural attendance. If you could click the next slide. I'll be doing this based on the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is a nationally representative survey that we've been running, and that will be running in several waves, 6 waves between last autumn. We did the first wave in October, November, through to this autumn. The second wave of which is what I'm going to largely be using for this this conversation, except where we need a larger sample, and I'll dip back into the previous research. The monitor, if you click on, it covers a wide range of content. So it asks people about their both physical and digital engagement, wider range of different things they do, some things around their attitudes, around other activities they do, and some factual things about, who else is in their household, if they had a vaccine, all that kind of thing. And within that, we're looking at a range of different time periods. So there's information on people looking back before the pandemic, information about what they're doing during the pandemic, and then moving on into some of this things around their kind of future thoughts, expectations, kind of current attitudes, and how that might impact on that. So there is summary reporting for the previous wave, but there's more coming soon. But you're getting a kind of sneak peek of the wave 2 findings. So what I'm going to be saying is essentially 3 things. That the cultural sector was unequal to start with in terms of engagement, that the impact has been felt unequally, and that there are reasons to think that that might play into greater inequality in future. So in that sense, I'm not bringing too much optimism, except to say that's a great prompt to do things differently and better. If we just start with the first of those points, I think it's something that's fairly broadly accepted and widely known. But just to illustrate that, we click on. So here we've taken a look at the occupational categories of a range of people in the monitor. And we've looked at a range of different art forms, and we've said, how often did you do these in the year before the pandemic? And we've got those categories in some kind of broad ranking in terms of senior managers, traditional professions, modern professions, etc. at the top, often sort of higher paid occupations, technical craft, semi-routine, manual and service occupations, and then routine manual and service occupations down at the bottom. So broadly speaking, without getting too much into the detail of it, for this range of activities, and we could have picked others, there's a broad rake from more activity at the top of this to less activity at the bottom. And that's something that we've obviously seen in lots of different contexts before. So no great surprises there. I mention it merely really to flag that when we talk about increasing inequality, we're talking about increasing inequality from an unequal starting point. So if we can click on. So what I'll talk about for the next bit is about the impact of the pandemic on different groups, and particularly in relation to two particular things. So we asked people whether, as a result of the pandemic, they had more, about the same, or less time, and questions which allowed us to work out whether they had more, about the same, or less money. Obviously, there's a range of other possible effects, but these are some of the key ones. So in considering that, we can look at it in a range of different ways. So one way we've looked at it is in terms of groups who tend to engage in the arts in different ways and at different levels. So we've used Audience Spectrum, the audience agency segmentation model, as a way of looking at that. And if we can just click on to the graphic, we can see we've got these 10 different segments, broadly speaking, arranged from higher engagement on one end, the orange ones, down to lower engagements on the right, the blue ones. And really the big standout thing is if we look at the red bars on the right-hand side, very many more people who are in typically lower engaged segments are, they have less money. So there's a clear impact in terms of those groups. So if we then click on, if we look at the impact on time, it's a less stark picture. Most people have had more time during the pandemic. I think we've all felt that to some extent. However, those who've had less time are a little bit more likely to be concentrated amongst those lower engaged groups, and the ones with most extra time are in the higher engaged groups. Okay, and on again. So if we looked at it in terms of engagement, we can also look at it in terms of occupation, those categories we looked at before. So if we look at these, if you move on, we can look in terms of the financial impact on people, and sure enough, the impact is concentrated amongst, sort of at the bottom of this list of occupational categories, particularly when it comes to people having more money, very much lower in those bottom two groups, so routine manual and semi-routine manual. And they're more likely to have either the same amount of money or less. So, for some of these groups, life has been sort of carrying on as normal without any let up. But, so clearly we've seen some, there aren't the financial opportunities in the pandemic that other groups have managed to find. If we move on, we can also see in terms of time, again, it's a less stark picture, but those groups are more likely to say they've had less time. And the group with the most extra time are senior managers and administrators. So as if there are any of those on the call, then hopefully you've enjoyed having the extra time, probably lack of commuting. Okay, so if we could move on further. So we've been talking particularly about so far the impact in terms of normal engagement level and occupation, but of course when we talk about inequality in the cultural sector, there's a range of other factors to think about. So ethnicity, disability and age are three really key dimensions to look at. And so if we move on, we can look at the impact on those. And sure enough, me being relentlessly kind of giving you all the bad news in one go, people who say they have more money are more likely to be white. People who say they have less money are more likely to be Asian, mixed or black ethnicities. Then if we look at disability, very similar pattern. We're starting to get the rhythm here, aren't we? People without a disability have more money, people with a disability less money. We look at age, clicking on, people who are older are more likely to have more money, people who are younger are more likely to have less money. So it's just a really compounding of the issue on these particular groups. Okay, now the picture for time is a little bit more complicated, partly because if you've remained kind of unaffected by the pandemic, then your amount of time is likely to have carried on as it was, but having more or less time can both be a sign of negative impacts. So it could be about loss of work or furlough or whatever, or it could just be being busier. And so what you tend to see is certain groups being kind of pushed to the extremes when it comes to amount of time. And sure enough, Asian, Black, mixed ethnicities have more time, but also are more likely to have less time. Disability is a slightly different case. We move on, just because there's it's a slight tilt towards people without disability having more time. But when we look at age, it's very stark picture that the sort of huge disruption to the lifestyles and activities of people who are younger plays through, and these sort of massive changes in terms of time allocation for younger people. And all of this really in some ways mirrors the sort of sector-specific employment thing we saw previously. Okay, so if we move on. So what we've seen there is that, from an unequal base, the impacts have been unequally felt. So then I guess that the remaining question is, where did we go from here? What happens next? So we've looked at three particular things for this. One is who's been vaccinated, because clearly we know that's going to be important to people. We've looked at who considers the COVID measures to have been too extreme relative to the risk. So where there's a kind of over preponderance of measures put in place that have negative downsides, who's feeling those downsides more potentially. And then finally, we asked people, once lockdown's over, if you saw something you wanted to see, would you be happy going? And there were a range of options to say, yes, but with some concern, or no, I'd really want to wait for the vaccine, etc. But this is just the top line of people who are saying, yep, I'm happy, so I'm good to go. And so what we're seeing here, particularly if you look at the age profile, is that there's quite a clear split in the population between older groups who've been more impacted by the health impacts of the pandemic, younger groups who tended to be more impacted by the kind of economic impacts of the pandemic, and as a result, the feeling of sort of that the measures are too extreme is packed into the younger age groups. And equally, when we look at who's been vaccinated, of course, it's older groups. But interestingly, it's also people who've been vaccinated are more likely to be white. That's partly probably a function of age, because a higher proportion of older people are white, but it may also reflect unequal rollout for various different reasons. There is some kind of suggestion as well that the COVID measures are more perceived as being too extreme amongst people who are mixed Asian and Black ethnicities, although the samples on this are quite small, because it was only asked in this wave, and this wave has a smaller sample. The net result of these is that we tend to see younger people being a little bit more likely to say that they would attend if there's something they wanted to see, but it's not a huge difference. But we might expect that as the vaccination rollout continues, that's likely to then bounce those groups a little bit higher. So we should see a kind of like a bit of a differential in terms of who's engaging. So if we just move on to this, the final bit. So this is just two other ways of looking at these same factors. For disability, in a way, there's not a huge amount of surprise. People who have a disability are more likely to be vaccinated. Of course they are, because that's one of the criteria. And people who haven't got a disability are more likely to be happy to attend in the near future. And again, I think most of us expect that. Just this final one, though, that I think is potentially quite interesting and challenging, is if we look at where respondents lived and allocated that to 4 bands based on level of deprivation, using indices of multiple deprivation, we can see essentially that the more affluent areas have much higher levels of vaccination, less affluent areas have much higher levels of people saying that the measures have been too extreme. And my hunch is that that could also be because that's where a lot of the economic pain has been felt in terms of the pandemic. And obviously, as we look forward to people's future engagement, we might reasonably expect that the economic impact is going to very much restrict the extent to which people can engage, particularly for paid activity. And it's worth noting that already there's a perceived gradient there in terms of who would attend even just at that level. So yes, so I think that's a bit of a summary of the bad news, really. But clearly, that's the challenge for us to respond to. And point noted about gender breakdowns. We will look at that when we publish it in the next couple of weeks.
Brilliant, thank you, Ollie. And it's worth saying that because just Lara brought that up. Do you want to do your summary, or want to leave that sitting on the screen there? As Lara brought it up, actually what we've also seen is there's a lot of stuff in the participation monitor around digital engagement as well. And although there have been some really interesting changes of who's engaging digitally, who's engaging with the sort of new online offers, I think the story is largely that they have not had a massive democratizing effect, particularly actually if they have spoken to people who were already quite engaged in a number of different ways. So some really interesting things around age, but not necessarily around having an equalizing impact overall, although we know that individual organisations certainly have experienced that. So, but interestingly, I'm now going to move on to Drs. John Wright and Karen Gray, who are going to, again, a little bit as we did last time, think about emerging themes that from their work talking to organisations. So again, very much call and response here. How are organisations responding in this environment? So John, Karen, I don't know who's going next first, but over to you guys, okay?
Thanks, Anne, that's great. If you just move to the next slide, we'll start on that one, yeah. So afternoon, everybody. So I'm just going to give a brief summary of what we've been doing, really. So we've interviewed more than 60 individuals from 40 plus organisations to date. And so these interviews, like Ben mentioned at the beginning, have been divided into several cohorts, which are theatres in England, cultural leaders in Northern Ireland, museums and galleries in the North East and North West of England, and festivals in Scotland. So if you move to the next slide. Great. So what is emerging from these interviews, and a little bit what Anne just sort of began to talk about, is an actually complex and nuanced picture when we take individual organisations, etc. So within the sector. So thinking about the research question today, what is the data telling us about whether COVID-19 is exacerbating existing inequalities? I think it is. There's no whether. And with that in mind, I think we just going to talk about some of the themes that have begun to emerge, really. So first of all, this theme of community engagement and civic responsibility. So there has been a real drive and depth of feeling right across the participants of a sense of civic responsibility within the arts to help support their local communities and utilise their resources, which are sometimes really limited, to contribute. But it's been a mixed picture in the sense that these practices are already established within some organisations, festivals and museums, yet some participants made it quite clear that the pandemic has shifted their focus to this form of activity, and that there is an underlying uncertainty as to how to harness the work that has been done for the future. And further, what does it really mean for the future of programming capacity and funding? For example, will it translate into different audiences engagement long term when there is issues of capacity or funding in different times as the kind of society changes and shifts in what is possible? So what kinds of audiences are engaging? So participants are telling us that there's been a shift to digital, and it has opened up engagement with audiences that had previously not engaged. So several festivals, both rural and urban, have reported positive engagement with local communities, particularly in terms of access, with public transport and travel issues negated due to online content festivals. Similarly, theatres and museums and galleries have noted some audiences flourishing online, particularly those who might have found it difficult to cross the threshold of a building before, as a result of the necessity to travel, with those that have mental health difficulties, people feeling safe within their own domestic spaces, for example, women with life-limiting conditions, or those actually with time poor. So teachers, for example, engaging in professional development activities offered by galleries. And actually, notably, participants are telling us that the older age band have actually proved really surprisingly eager to engage digitally. And this kind of leads on to the final point that I'm going to make here before Karen speaks. this leads on to the question of value and equity in these emerging forms of practice. So many festivals and cultural leaders in Northern Ireland that work within broader event subsectors have adapted the ways in which they sell tickets, for example, for digital offerings. So some have adopted a donation system by arguing that this attracts a wider audience base and thus not excluding those that could not afford or access the event. Others suggest that a pricing system had increased the duration of engagement that audiences gave the event because they had literally bought into it. Similarly, there has been a significant discussion, interestingly, of subscription models, particularly for music festivals, where content can be accessed at different times of day to suit families with work and childcare commitments, particularly. Organisations offering learning and participation programs found that digital offerings sometimes have lower perceived value than those delivered in person, although they may sometimes take twice as much time and resources to develop. Museums and galleries have been working to overcome digital poverty. So among some of the participants, they've sort of said that they've started paying for data and purchasing devices for participants, but often repurposing money that might previously have been spent on travel and hospitality. So if you go to the next slide, and Karen, would you like to take it away?
Hi, yes, thanks, John. I just wanted to contribute 3 areas of detail, really, to build on John's comments. And these really reflect my focus on the case studies so far on theatre and museums and galleries. Firstly, about the appetite to return, the audience appetite to return. I consistently hear from theatre-based organisations in particular that they feel there is a real appetite among their existing audiences to return. And as evidence for this, they often cite sort of supportive feedback and loyalty represented in sort of bookings for future or patience around moving or rebooking for cancelled shows. Visitors to museums and galleries haven't been able to demonstrate their loyalty in quite the same way, but when buildings were open in the autumn, interviewees said that visitors appreciated the opportunity even if footfall was low. I suppose the flip side to this story about appetite is that many interviewees, particularly those working where engagement with culture has historically been low, are concerned that it is going to be hard to reconnect with audiences. They worry that people will have got out of the habit of in-person participation and more used to spending their time in other ways. Their incomes will have fallen, and that some people will continue to feel it's risky to use public transport or be in close contact with other people. As one theatre director suggested to me, it could be almost as if we're opening up the theatre for the first time again. Many of those I've talked to have reported a real desire to build on the Black Lives Matter movement, and there is clearly increased awareness of inequities that relate to ethnicity and colour. As a response, interviewees are telling me about initiatives that spotlight and counter these kinds of inequalities, and programmes of work that are intended to tell new and more diverse stories. However, of course, structural barriers are still there, and there is a sense that momentum for change could easily be lost as the sector gets busy trying to reopen. I wanted to say something about young people and children. Interviewees working with this group are voicing really significant concerns for their mental health. And it has been suggested that young people aren't currently comfortable with some of the digital formats being widely used. For example, some of the people I've spoken to have had greater success in engaging young people and children using more personalised touch points like one-to-one WhatsApp or text messaging. Relationships with education providers have been disrupted, and it isn't clear when schools are going to return to cultural sector buildings. And there are also worries around the reduced presence of arts and culture in education generally. Going back to Lara, what Lara was saying earlier, I have to say there is a real sense of hope around the inspiring participatory kind of on the ground work, the civic engagement work that the sector has been doing during the pandemic, as well as the increased diversity of methods they've been using to do this. And there is a real hope that this will lead to a wider variety of people participating in making and consuming culture in future, including through these kind of hybrid live and digital models that people are talking about. If there's a note of caution, as John said earlier, I guess no one's going to be surprised by this, there is also quite a bit of uncertainty about how the sector is going to sustain, learn from, and importantly, evaluate this kind of work. Thank you.
Brilliant. Karen, thank you so much. That was an extremely interesting reflection there, how organisations, it sounds as though I'm really interested by this tone of optimism that I know that you picked up in some of your research. I think that is actually really interesting. What I'm hearing from, well, both you and John were just talking about there is perhaps, is there a whiff of organisations being much more centered on the issues of their on understanding actually what their users actually need from them. So I'm hearing, I think we've certainly seen this in a sort of an appetite for research and data, people being very, very keen to find out how things are playing out in different kinds of participation groups and audiences and so on. So I'm wondering whether there is a kind of a, one of the more hopeful things for the future is this sort of sense that people are listening to their users more and being much more tuned into what's working and what's not. Anyway, I shouldn't preempt what Dr. Roaa may be about to share with us. Roaa, I know you were going to respond to some of this, but from your position, thinking a lot about cultural production and consumption at the University of Manchester, what are your reflections on some of those insights?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I think it's really great to be able to hear about the emerging findings at this time, and also to cross-reference it with our own project at the Centre on Dynamics of Ethnicity, where we are specifically looking at how COVID and Black Lives Matter movement have impacted ethnic inequality in the cultural sector. The major migration of production and consumption habits to online content and platforms has shifted the modalities of work, of cultural production, and of course, cultural engagement habits, as we have heard from John and Karen. From the emerging findings of this project led by the Centre for Cultural Value, it seems that this crisis has shaken the traditional pool of audiences, and dare I say, led to engagement with previously untapped audiences. And in that sense, as much as the current crisis has presented a great challenge to the cultural sector, it's also presenting a unique opportunity to revisit established assumptions and practices about cultural engagement and audiences, which had so far enabled inequality. Two things though spring to mind in response to these emerging findings in audience engagement. The first one is of digital poverty, which would impact digital engagement with culture and further limit the access of those already strained by existing inequalities. So I think if the trend for digital engagement is to continue, then provisions need to be set in place to address that. And the second is a matter of sustainability. I personally think that it's really healthy to continue the digital engagement, but while heavily subsidized cultural organizations might be able to continue their digital offering, other commercial organizations might find it tricky to generate venues, I think, and potentially alienate any newly developed audiences who might simply not be able to afford it. I'm also really pleased to hear that cultural organizations are actively thinking of having more diverse representations and programming. But as John, Karen have highlighted, the momentum created by the Black Lives Matter can easily be lost. In our project and through interviews with ethnically diverse creatives and cultural workers, this was a real concern, with some already noticing that diversity is falling down the agenda. And the other concern is that even though there is a general uptake of diversity, it still is not translating to structural changes. So we are increasingly seeing more diversity schemes, but without an appreciation for the value of diversity. The fear is that some diversity initiatives might perpetuate the precarity of ethnically diverse people while increasing their outputs, and so thus rendering them more easily exploited and expandable. And the impact of financial pressure on organizations mean that sometimes these diversity initiatives, regardless of how problematic they could be, might be the first to go in moments of economic panic. Finally, and this is a general comment that relates to both presentation and to some of our initial findings, showing that COVID has made the cultural sector more risk averse. And this is likely to continue during the sector recovery. And that could have a huge impact on the agenda for a more equal centre. Because a risk averse sector leads to reliance on all tested and trusted models, both in terms of outputs and workforce, which usually excludes talent and people from ethnically diverse and working class backgrounds. Particularly when it comes to ethnically diverse talent, they are often considered as emerging, regardless of their experience in the industry. And so the fear is that diverse creatives and content might be sidestepped in favor of what commissioners think is safe and will bring bums on the seats. But despite the dark picture, I personally think the opportunity to shake old established habits and reinvent modes of cultural engagement that place inequality at the heart is positive. And I think I'm hopeful that it will bring healthy changes to the sector. So I'm going to stop now and hopefully we can move on to the discussion where we can continue these questions and hopeful aspiration for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I sound like a sort of mad Pollyanna optimism dictator, and I'm not that at all. I mean, I think, that doesn't necessarily help us very much, does it, by casting a veil over, some of the, I mean, as you say, the structural issues being really profound. I think there's something really interesting, because you'll see in the chat, there's there are lots of amazing examples of how organisations have been standing back and saying, well, what is our civic role in this time of crisis? And I think that has, when you look at individual cases, and maybe it's more than that, because I think lots of people are also talking about these things, there has been this sort of appetite to rethink what do we do in our community, what are we for, and I think there's been some really, really amazing experimentation there. But offsetting that against, I think the thing that you've picked up is so important, the idea that organisations at the moment can be nothing else other than risk averse. It's very, very difficult, where actually not pinging back to what when resources are very scarce is going to be incredibly difficult. So it does feel there was some interesting somebody, I'm sorry, I wrote down your name, somebody further up from a local authority said, actually, what is the role of local authorities and the local level? Are there enough of us here in this conversation? I think your point was, but I think this is really interesting, this notion of how we come together and reimagine what it is that we're for in our local places seems to be really, really interesting. So can I just ask can I ask my colleagues, has anybody got any specific questions for our researchers they haven't had a chance to ask yet? Because if so, do go for it right now. I'm not seeing anything in here in particular. I'm seeing some interesting comments here from so there's been this interesting discussion again around, we're talking about Lawrence Batley here around use of digital content and whether or not, again, that is opening up new paths and channels, which I think is a kind of an interesting thing that you raised there as well, Roa, that in some ways the trend for digital engagement is a good thing, but actually, unless you're a very large organisation with £7 million, or however much it was, to really experiment, just how easy is that going to be? Actually, if you're very pressed, are you not in fact going to just ping back to the usual models? I think that's absolutely spot on. So would anybody else like to comment on those matters, panels? Can I ask John and Karen, if you'd like to respond to what Rose just said in terms of perspective from your work?
Yeah. Sorry, Karen, do you want to go first?
You spoke first, John, you go.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree, actually, with what Rose was saying. Particularly, it rang true, really, from what I'm sort of hearing in the interviews, that actually many of the smaller festivals, for example, don't have the capacity to offer anything digitally. especially when they run on volunteers. We didn't really get around to actually discussing that, but a lot of that labour as well is volunteer labour, and so there's kind of nuances there, really. And also, I think that the digital poverty has kind of come up in different ways within sort of overt ways within the interviews, but then also sort of just mentioning the kind of lack of engagement actually from some groups that would normally engage in place-based, because they were able to go, it was in the community, you know, it was in their kind of like their area that the kind of festivals and events were open, and they weren't able to happen. So and the festival was too small to then be able to put on anything digitally, so they just dissipated. So there's that kind of narrative that's also kind of happening as well. And there's been some comments about, Karen might want to talk a bit more about this, because within museums and galleries, I think she's finding this, especially with sort of participation with people with, you know, childcare kind of issues, etc., within the sector. But what was coming up is that actually a lot of the kind of what was being fed back was that having kind of events at different times of day has helped a lot, and kind of or events that are kind of our music that is sort of filmed and you know, archived, etc., and from some of the larger kind of festivals and organizations. But actually, yeah, that is a real interesting kind of change, that, you know, maybe we could have kind of events at lunchtime or something like that during the working day. Yeah.
Exactly, that's what I meant by that sort of a increased level of user-centricity. And if you just take the example of people refusing to give refunds, so it's been, you know, 150 years of people asking for a refund for a ticket, and that's just impossible, but suddenly it's become possible, and those things make an enormous amount of difference about just that user-centricity, about how we think about doing things. Karen, were you going to did you want to comment?
I was just going to quickly pick up on your point, Anne, about links between local authorities and cultural organisations, because there's been a couple of really good examples of cultural organisations working much more closely with local authorities, but around these kind of really kind of on the ground kind activities, such as food banks or creative food provision of all kinds. And that just makes me slightly worried about, you know, the future, because it isn't sustainable, I think, in the long term. So yeah, there's a question of how that's going to be picked up in future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something coming through in the chat here about being smaller organisations, and just how much, well, as in fact, Roaa, as you were just saying, how much bandwidth you have in terms, and including resources to actually to reinvent yourself at all, you know, to step out and to become to do things differently. And I think there's some comments here about trying to develop that, what we know is going to be very important, that hybrid model for the future, the hybrid digital live model. That all takes a lot of risk taking, you know, underwriting things that just might not work. Jeffrey, you've pointed out, Jeff Crossley just mentioned that in our research, you know, what we can see is that you get there's quite a really noticeable split among online audiences over lockdown, between a kind of older audiences who are sort of happy to have high quality BBC style streaming of, you know, the old product, but actually younger audiences who are doing things saying, well, we much prefer immersive, that, you know, that next generation who are our, you know, our future audiences actually want something that doesn't look like the stuff that we're doing at the moment. So in fact, these great examples of experimentation that we've got here coming up in the chat, we need much more of that. But who can support that level of experimentation in very, very risky times, I think is a super interesting question. Can I just, there's some quite interesting things coming through from people working in local authorities. And I think, Charles Ingram, you laid down that, you said, where are the examples of the good practice we need to, we need recommendations for actions and things that we can do now. And I think people are rising to that challenge. I'd like to see critical people in places. I think, Amanda, it's true that lots of those very people-focused community projects have really suddenly seized sort of the digital nettle in interesting ways, in ways perhaps they hadn't thought was possible before. Right, great. Ben, can I ask now, I think we're drawing to the moment where we may be just doing a little bit of wrapping up. Do have a look at the chat if you're not looking, because lots of really some interesting debate happening there. But I'm going to ask Mikey, are you there, Mikey? Can you show us the results to our poll? How positive are we all feeling? So, to what extent do you think that you and your organisation will make progress on inequality following the pandemic? So 4% of you, not many, thought no change in approach, a little progress, significant progress, and not sure. So we're feeling pretty positive about ourselves, and we're also, it seems, feeling pretty positive about the sector. So we trust ourselves to get things done rather than we necessarily do others, which might just be a reflection of the group of people that we have here, or our sense of being able to make things happen beyond our own small universe. But there we go. There's an interesting difference between how much progress we ourselves think we're going to make and between what we think organisations will do. But overall, it looks as though we are positive that things may change as a result of the changes that we've seen this year. Ben, did you want to have a go at summing up some of the, what have you found particularly interesting in the conversations so far?
Oh, impossible, isn't it, to sum up such a rich conversation and dialogue, and thanks so much for all of those examples in the chat. I think what I'll take away, certainly in terms of the research going forward, is how we can amplify disruptive change. We're obviously picking up some stories through the case study interviews, but I think when we reach the last stages of this project, it's really about convening those in some kind of coherent way and explaining implications and recommendations indeed to policymakers. I know DCMS are very, very keen to hear of how things can rebuild in a more positive way, for example. So we really do need those rich examples that will endure rather than kind of flash in the pan moments. I mean, I'm really struck by age. You know, I think like most of us, looking at, say, attitudes towards vaccination, towards digital engagement, the key variable here is age. So we know in terms of cultural workers that the people most significantly affected have been young professionals, and there is very real founded fears of a lost generation in the cultural sector. And that is certainly something that we're highlighting and emphasising to DCMS, for example. And likewise, you know, in terms of audiences, there are huge, age seems to be the thing that really dictates how much extra time people have had, how much less money people have had, their attitudes to what kind of digital content they want to engage with. So I think we absolutely need to keep our eye on that particular demographic. I'm keen to kind of leave, like lots of people, on a note of optimism. So it's worth saying, I think, that we've heard some really inspiring stories of organisations becoming more collegial, more collaborative, about radically rethinking their philosophies and business models. And certainly something our advisory group are encouraging us to do is to really focus on those positive stories. So I think, you know, there is the data is very, very depressing, of course. There is no doubt that the pandemic has exacerbated what already were, as everyone has said, existing inequalities in supply and demand, in production and consumption. But I think we have a responsibility as a team of researchers to really focus on those positive stories, actually, and what those more, you know, constructive business models might look like moving forwards. So a few rambling thoughts for me on what's been a really, really rich discussion, and thanks again to everyone who's contributed.
Brilliant. I'm going to give the last word to Lara and Roaa, if they don't mind, just springing this on you as our respondents, since you, I think, stretched our thinking in your initial responses. So can I ask you both, if you don't mind, what will you take away from this conversation? Lara, we can't hear you. Come back.
I think I'm still, I think as a sector, I think people are still really hard, they're struggling to relinquish that kind of, we are the voice of culture, you know, like this sort of booming voice that comes out. And I think what has happened in all the disruptive kind of projects that people are talking about in the chat, you can't just go in and then you can't go back. And the assumption was everything closed for a year and then we're all going to be vaccinated and then we're going to be opening again. That's not what's happening here, because a lot of activity happened in lots of different ways. Some of it was great, some of it was not that great. Some people couldn't do anything. And I think also, let's not be so binary about our thinking. But the most important thing is there is not a single authorial voice on culture. In the meantime, people went off and found their own ways to experience culture in the ways that they wanted to do it. So the thing that I would really be clear about is that there's not a disconnect between we're doing workforce here and audience there. because even slightly with the presentations, there was a bit of a lack of crossover with that, and that might just be because of, you know, people in how they're interpreting their research. But when this comes together, you don't get one without the other. So that the absolute thing is audiences will engage where they see themselves represented. And if you don't have different voices creating content, then you won't have that audience. So it's, you know, yes, we have been, I mean, lots of people saying, we talked about this in the chat, but you need to see what's happened in the year, because that's not necessarily on the radar of everyone that's in this room at the moment.
Yeah.
I like that's really, that's exciting creatively.
I think that's a brilliant. I also think that's a great, you know, challenge for us, because I think we've only just started to say, how do we start to put our sort of research findings together? So I think that's a really, really good challenge as well as a hugely important observation. Roa.
Yeah, thank you, Lara and Anne. And I think two kind of points of worry and then one point of optimism. The 2 points of worry is particularly the older audiences and kind of perceptions and how they're going to rejoin the sector, and also if organizations might be, their traditional programmings have been targeting particular demographic, then maybe you need to think again about it. And as you said, you know, Anne, with, you know, younger people kind of finding their own ways, so you need new audiences, and we need to think about that. And the second one is, again, about the young people and their engagement in culture, and the fact that, you know, even in schools, because there is this lack of focus now, or they're being decentralized, arts and theatre and culture in general. And with what happened with freelancers, you know, we're going to lose you know, the workforce of the future, and so something urgently needs to be done about this. Whoever needs to hear us, please, you know, and that starts from school to kind of participation with cultural organization. And the third one is just about collectives, and I mean, the chat is brilliant. You know, all the voices here and the voices in the chats are brilliant, and I think we can only get out of this if we kind of work collaboratively and think collectively. And I think our collective power is I think it's powerful. So I have faith in that collective power and collective thinking.
I'm very much enjoying that, a vote for the collective. And I think from Lara, you know, a kind of an encouragement for us to not go back. Let's follow out the people that we're there for, rather than prepare the way from them. It has changed the dynamics, hasn't it, in quite an interesting way. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much to all our speakers. It's very, very generous of you to come and give up your afternoon, especially our guests. But thank you all. And thank you very much as well, everyone participating in a really fantastic chat. So we're going to capture that. And I think we will use that as some stimulation for the kind of conversations and the research conclusions that we're going to draw in the future. So can I say thank you to all very much indeed, and please do give us that feedback. Drop your thoughts in there. It is going to make a difference to what we do next. Thank you all so much, and farewell.